Imagine learning tonight that Sumerian priests demanded human lives in addition to rain. The terrifying words, 10 youthful souls shall be offered to Inanna, were revealed by AI decoding tablets. Urukadua ratos tujublas. What if these rites were UN isolated incidents, but rather were a part of a pattern that hinted at the internal collapse of entire civilizations? Listen to how these deciphered warnings reverberate over millennia, challenging us to re-evaluate what really brings societies to their knees. These old texts were silent mysteries for centuries. Their symbols, whole civilizations preserved in stone and clay, but beyond the reach of contemporary knowledge, gazed back at scholars like locked doors without keys, rebuilding languages without living speakers, translation aids, or Rosetta Stone equivalents to serve as a starting point, appeared to be an almost impossible undertaking. Before we start our journey tonight, please get comfortable, close your eyes, and let your mind wander. If you like these calming stories from the past, please take a moment to subscribe to Dreamtime History for Sleep and hit the bell icon. That way, you'll never miss a new story, and we can make a peaceful place for you to sleep at night. The exception, however, was the Rosetta Stone, which gave the key to Egyptian hieroglyphs. Numerous other writing systems, ranging from Mayan glyphs to Sumerian cuneiform, were still entirely unintelligible. After studying a single inscription for a lifetime, researchers would make educated guesses based on the archaeological context, but they would never truly understand what they were reading. Many came to the conclusion that these languages were extinct, their knowledge and stories relegated to a place of eternal historical silence. Then everything changed because of artificial intelligence. Thousands of inscriptions could be processed at once by machine learning systems, which could then examine patterns in whole text collections. AI could find patterns across hundreds of tablets, identifying that particular markings frequently appeared in similar contexts. Whereas human researchers might examine individual symbols, these algorithms were able to reconstruct meaning from statistical patterns, contextual relationships, and cross-references between various writing systems without the need for bilingual texts. The breakthrough occurred when artificial intelligence started to recognize that symbols from entirely different civilizations occasionally performed similar tasks. Mayan calendrical inscriptions may have a similar function to a marking found in Sumerian temple records, implying universal ideas about ritual, time, or social organization. The technology found order in seemingly chaotic symbol arrangements by approaching these ancient scripts as cryptographic challenges rather than linguistic puzzles. The result was a new approach to historical research. AI could determine numerical systems by analyzing recurrent sequences, identify grammatical structures by examining word order patterns, and even recommend pronunciations based on comparative linguistics. Despite evolving in total isolation from one another, the technology showed that many ancient writing systems shared fundamental logical frameworks. Layers of meaning that had eluded conventional scholarship were revealed by this computational method. Artificial intelligence (AI) could work with fragmentary texts, damaged tablets, and even reconstruct missing portions based on pattern completion algorithms, whereas human researchers might concentrate on the most visually striking or well-preserved inscriptions. As the scope of analysis expanded from individual artifacts to entire writing corpora, patterns emerged that were only apparent when hundreds or thousands of texts were examined collectively. The ramifications were significant. Civilizations that had been silent for thousands of years suddenly started talking again, their records and stories coming out of markings that scholars had thought were unintelligible. This technological innovation promised to completely alter our perception of how ancient societies operated, what they valued, and how they perceived the world. It did more than merely add details to pre-existing historical narratives. We now stand on the precipice of these discoveries, eager to learn what these rediscovered voices have to say about the most persistent questions and the most profound trends in human civilization. Consider how a straightforward agricultural text could be transformed into something much more disturbing. Tablet Uruk, 217 from Inanna's temple was categorized by scholars for decades, alongside regular records of harvest ceremonies and weather rituals. Its markings, which were part of the administrative records of an ancient agricultural society, were believed to track crop cycles and seasonal rains. Given that this was a civilization reliant on the Euphrates River and that survival depended on water management, the initial assumptions seemed reasonable. A new reality emerged from the translation by the artificial intelligence. The algorithm found instructions for ritual offerings where researchers expected meteorological data. The line, 10 youthful souls shall be offered to Inanna, came from what seemed to be official documentation rather than a dramatic epic or battle narrative. The text provided administratively precise numbers, conditions, and procedures. It was neither poetic nor metaphorical. There was similar grim accounting on another tablet from Lagash during the plague. It was written during a time when there was a lot of sickness, and it said that 100 pure lives would be sacrificed to build a wall that disease cannot pass. The language implied that these were not willing participants but rather deliberate offerings, their lives measured as building blocks for spiritual fortification. With the dry efficiency of temple logistics, the records contained information about ritual protocols, transportation plans, and selection criteria. Tablet 132, ascribed to a priest by the name of Inshar, contained the most terrifying passage. His prophecy, which read, "The city will burn in fire, the Euphrates will run with blood," was not made in a vacuum. Archaeological evidence shows that internal conflict and environmental degradation were the main causes of Sumerian city collapses. Droughts decimated agriculture, the river itself shifted its course, and social structures broke apart. It becomes evident that environmental catastrophe and outside invasion were not the only factors contributing to Sumer's decline. The systematic practices of sacrifice point to a society trying to manipulate its surroundings by drastic means, possibly growing more desperate as more conventional approaches failed. The size of these rites suggests that they were institutionalized practices that were incorporated into the religious and political structures rather than sporadic ceremonies. Ritualized violence is a pattern of internal decay revealed by the AI decipherment. We witness a civilization consuming itself from within and striving to preserve order through ever more dramatic means, rather than one that has been abruptly overrun from without. When the archaeological record reveals signs of social disintegration and civil war, the priest's prophecy about the river flowing with blood assumes new significance. These interpretations make us reevaluate our definition of collapse. The Sumerian civilization did not experience this event. Rather, it was a process in which they took part, recorded, and possibly expedited through their crisis management. The institutionalization of human sacrifice points to a leadership structure that was prepared to go above and beyond to keep power while society collapsed around them. Now examine how other ancient societies, each with its own approaches to recording and handling crises, exhibit this pattern of internal decay preceding collapse. As a warning about how civilizations consume themselves, the Sumerian case creates a template that will be replicated throughout cultures and millennia. The Maya adopted a different strategy, creating whole calendrical systems to forecast the cycles of collapse and renewal, whereas the Sumerians recorded their civilization's decline as it occurred. AI decipherments show that the Maya envisioned something more complex, a gradual descent into disorder rather than a sudden apocalyptic ending. The 2012 phenomenon that garnered international attention was mainly misinterpreted as foretelling a single catastrophic event. According to inscriptions from important ceremonial centers like Tikal and Palenque, there would be a cycle of eternal darkness, during which time social structures would deteriorate and the cosmic balance would need to be restored. The repeated use of the phrase blood is the only bridge through which the gods may hear us in ritual texts suggests that the Maya saw sacrifice as a necessary maintenance measure against cosmic entropy rather than as cruelty. Their offerings and bloodletting rituals were regarded as necessary procedures to preserve the precarious equilibrium between the material and spiritual worlds. The calendrical systems tracked the times when these routine maintenance tasks became most important, serving as both timekeeping and early warning systems. These translations make it abundantly evident that the Maya collapse was the result of several failure points rather than an abrupt disaster. Archaeological discoveries indicate a rise in city-state warfare, while environmental evidence indicates that the collapse of the classical period was accompanied by protracted droughts. Under these increasing pressures, the ritual system that had preserved ecological consciousness and social cohesiveness gradually collapsed. The complex ceremonial calendar that had governed their society for centuries was no longer able to be adequately maintained as resources declined and conflicts escalated. According to the AI decipherments, the Maya were aware that their civilization was characterized by cycles of expansion and decline. Their calendrical predictions focused on the end of one cycle and the possible start of another, rather than the end of the world. What happens when societies lose their ties to ritual practices that uphold social balance and ecological awareness is the real caution contained in their writings. Their recognition that upholding civilization required ongoing, deliberate effort and sacrifice is reflected in the emphasis on blood as a conduit to the gods. Although many ancient cultures shared this cyclical perspective on history, the Maya transformed it into an intricate system of science and religion. They may have thought in terms of civilizational cycles rather than linear advancement, as evidenced by their long count calendar, which measured time in units spanning thousands of years. The year 2012 was not a conclusion. Rather, it was a turning point. When the current cycle ended and the required customs and social harmony were upheld, a new one might have started. A case study of how societies can acknowledge their own vulnerability and yet fail to stop decline is the Maya collapse. When social structures broke under stress, their advanced knowledge of cyclical time and environmental patterns did not help them. According to the inscriptions, they were aware of the warning signs: war, drought, and failing rituals, but were unable to muster the will to alter their course. A common theme among fallen civilizations is this pattern of foresight without practical action. Now think about Easter Island, the world's most remote inhabited location, where a civilization progressively ate up its own foundations. For many generations, the prevailing narrative blamed the collapse on environmental misfortune or European contact, portraying a vulnerable population being overpowered by outside forces. A different narrative, one of destruction and conscious recognition, is presented by the decoded Mamari and Aruku Karina tablets. These inscriptions show a society that is acutely aware of its own decline. One passage states quite clearly, "The island has no more trees, the forest is gone, the land is dead." This is a contemporary observation that was documented at the time of the deforestation, not conjecture after the fact. A different tablet has a deeper meaning. "We have offered blood to the gods, but the gods no longer listen. We are dying, and no one is coming." This phrase implies that ritual practices persisted despite their diminishing effectiveness, a desperate attempt to preserve tradition in the face of failing systems. The most eerie is the line, "We saw where our path would lead, but no one listened." This is not a cry of impending doom, but rather one of slow awakening, of a society realizing its unsustainable course but still unable to alter it. The Rapa Nui people did not abruptly disappear. Rather, they underwent a protracted unraveling in which famine, conflict, and social disintegration resulted from resource depletion. A component of this ritual system that ultimately failed to preserve ecological balance was probably represented by their well-known Moai statues, which are frequently romanticized as enigmatic artifacts. According to archaeological findings, the island once had a diversified ecosystem with palm forests that supplied building materials for homes, canoes, and soil stabilization. The society's infrastructure for survival was progressively weakened as tree removal increased for agricultural and transportation purposes. There is a tragic gulf between knowledge and action, as the tablet translations imply that this process was understood even as it proceeded. A picture of internal ecological overshoot is revealed by these deciphered texts. The locals realized that their island's carrying capacity was being surpassed, but significant change was thwarted by political incentives, social structures, or religious customs, perhaps motivated by clan rivalry or the conviction that more vigorous ritual activity could stop the environmental deterioration. The Moai construction probably continued even as resources decreased. Perhaps the clearest illustration of a society recording its own unsustainable practices while continuing to engage in them can be found in this case study. Because of its isolation, Easter Island is a controlled experiment in the collapse of civilization. There are no outside invaders or changes in the climate that go beyond normal. It is simply a human population that has outgrown its natural resources and is documenting the process as it occurs. Written by people who witnessed the slow narrowing of their world, the tablets serve as a sobering reminder of the dangers of disregarding ecological boundaries. On a civilizational level, the pattern that emerges is one of cognitive dissonance, the capacity to identify a problematic trajectory while lacking the social or political means to change it. A common theme among fallen civilizations is this conflict between knowledge and action, implying that awareness by itself cannot stop collapse without corresponding adjustments to social structure and behavior. This dynamic is especially evident in the story of Easter Island, where ecological mismanagement has a greater impact due to its remote location. Their final message speaks to a universal human challenge, the difficulty of changing course when societies become invested in unsustainable practices that go beyond their particular situation. The Moai that remain today are monuments to this paradox rather than enigmatic artifacts. They are stone witnesses to a society that recognized its situation but was unable to overcome it. What if beneath the imposing stones of one of archaeology's most renowned sites was a sinister secret? Gobekli Tepe, a serene hub of early religious practice where hunter-gatherers gathered for spiritual ceremonies, has long been regarded as humanity's first temple. A vision of Neolithic society moving towards civilization through shared ritual rather than conflict was suggested by the enormous T-shaped pillars arranged in circular patterns, which also suggested communal worship and early architectural achievement. According to this interpretation, the location demonstrated spiritual growth before organized farming and sophisticated social structures. The pillar inscriptions analysis by artificial intelligence reveals something far more complicated and disturbing than mere worship. The algorithm recognized markings that were previously disregarded as a complex symbolic system that described ritual practices. The language used in one deciphered passage, which instructs, choose the strongest, bring them to the largest stone on the day the sun dies, let their blood spill upon the stone, suggests a formalized selection process and precise ceremonial timing, suggesting that this was institutionalized practice rather than spontaneous violence. Today, 500 were offered to the gods, according to another translated section, is a matter-of-fact record. This number suggests a scale that goes beyond individual rituals and indicates systematic organization. This measurement of human sacrifices implies that the location served as a hub for organized sacrifice, as opposed to sporadic ritual assemblies. Advanced social organization and resource management devoted to these practices are indicated by the logistical requirements for handling such numbers. In a cosmology where ritual violence acted as a mediator between the earthly and spiritual worlds, the serpent glyphs carved throughout the complex once regarded as ornamental or symbolic elements now appear through translation as guardians of gateways to the other world. These carvings may have been protective symbols for thresholds where sacrificial ceremonies took place. According to the inscriptions, This data suggests that religious and political power structures are maintained over many generations by organized ritual violence. Such intricate stone circles would have required coordinated labor and resource allocation to build and maintain, indicating that these activities were essential to the society's operation rather than ancillary pursuits. The magnitude of the proposed sacrifices suggests that they were essential to preserving hierarchical authority and social cohesiveness. The site's eventual abandonment might be a reflection of the population's rejection of this system, or of its long-term unviability. The resource requirements and social costs of upholding such complex sacrificial practices may have become intolerable. As Neolithic societies moved toward agriculture and settled life, the site's meticulous burial implies a conscious departure from these customs rather than an abrupt abandonment. The resulting rewriting of early religious practice calls into question how we interpret Neolithic society. Gobekli Tepe seems to have been a hub for systematic ritual violence that was essential to social organization and cosmological understanding, rather than peaceful spiritual assemblies. The AI translations make us reevaluate how early human societies dealt with institutionalized violence and the beginnings of religious practice. Numerous ancient civilizations exhibit this pattern of sacrificial practices that uphold political and religious authority, indicating that these were recurring elements of early complex societies rather than isolated developments. The earliest known illustration of this pattern can be found in the Gobekli Tepe evidence, which delays the emergence of organized ritual violence and its link to social power structures. Even Egypt's magnificent pyramids and tombs have disturbing realities hidden beneath their beauty. Egyptologists praised these burial customs for generations as highly developed spiritual preparations, complete with elaborate mummification procedures, well-chosen grave goods, and elaborate tomb paintings that all alluded to a symbolic journey to the afterlife. According to the dominant interpretation, the beliefs of ancient Egypt were metaphorical, with rituals signifying spiritual transformation instead of actual physical prerequisites for immortality. A more unsettling reality is revealed by artificial intelligence deciphering tomb inscriptions, according to translations from royal burial chambers. The blood of the living must merge with the mummified flesh, implying a physical transfer of life force as opposed to a ceremonial one, in order to activate the pharaoh's immortal essence. Another passage states that 20 living souls shall be offered, suggesting that these were planned sacrifices rather than willing participants. Rather than being a spiritual metaphor, the term implies a belief that eternal life required actual biological continuation. These textual revelations are corroborated by archaeological evidence. The remains of people who seem to have been buried alive with royalty can be found at several burial sites. Their placements imply formal placement rather than accidental deposition. In order to guarantee aristocratic immortality, the victims were usually lower status people, slaves, or prisoners of war, and their lives were treated as ceremonial commodities. These sacrifices involved conscious entombment rather than post-mortem placement, as evidenced by the presence of air pockets and struggle marks in some tombs. The fact that live burial is a consistent practice across dynasties indicates that it was institutionalized rather than unique. The magnitude of these rites suggests that human offerings for royal tombs are the focus of well-organized logistics selection, procedures, transportation plans, and ceremonial protocols. According to the materials devoted to these customs, they were regarded as necessary elements of a respectable funeral rather than optional rituals. What comes out is a reworking of the ideas of Egyptian immortality. The evidence indicates that they believed in a literal transfer of life energy from the sacrifice to the deceased, rather than considering their practices to be purely symbolic. Instead of using symbolic representations, this physical understanding of afterlife preparation required real human resources. When considered in conjunction with these sacrificial practices, which are both intended for physical preservation and continuation rather than spiritual metaphor, the intricate mummification process itself assumes a new significance. These practices had important social ramifications. Egyptian society was probably tense due to the ongoing demand for sacrificial victims, especially among the lower classes who would have been most susceptible to selection. Social stratification and resource allocation problems that ultimately undermine the civilization may have been exacerbated by the economic resources invested in these rituals, both in terms of human lives and material expenditures. Numerous ancient societies exhibit this pattern of literal sacrifice as opposed to symbolic sacrifice. But Egypt's extensive documentation offers especially thorough proof. The extent and durability of these practices imply that they were not ancillary traditions, but rather essential to their understanding of the cosmos. The well-known pyramids and tombs serve as both architectural wonders and proof of a belief system that required human sacrifice in exchange for eternal life. Later dynasties may have abandoned these customs due to social pressures or shifting religious perspectives. The literal meaning of blood sacrifice seems to have given way to more symbolic interpretations as Egyptian civilization developed, which may reflect broader cultural changes in their understanding of the connection between physical life and spiritual continuation. This data casts doubt on our idealized conception of ancient Egyptian spirituality and exposes a sinister side to their ornate funeral customs. In addition to artistic creations and architectural wonders, the quest for immortality also involved institutionalized, systematic human sacrifice. This trend of utilizing human lives to attain permanence adds to the larger picture of how ancient societies attempted to combat mortality through ceremonial means. The real significance of these customs is found in the way they capture a universal human conflict between the need for eternal life and the expenses involved in obtaining it. An extreme example of this struggle is Egypt's intricate attempts to evade death through ritual sacrifice, with their magnificent monuments serving as both a testament to the darker imperatives of human civilization and an accomplishment of it. Civilizations occasionally record their decline while it is happening all around them. Cyrus the Great's Persian conquest was portrayed as an external triumph over a beleaguered empire, continuing the long-standing framing of Babylonian history through military defeat. Babylonian scribes were aware of their society's decline long before foreign armies reached the gates. According to AI translations of administrative and religious tablets, the military collapse may have been only the last act in a larger drama of moral and social disintegration, as these records vividly depict internal decay. The deciphered texts, which show how material wealth and luxury were undermining traditional virtues, repeatedly warn that Babylon is losing its soul, while merchant accounts describe corruption permeating every level of administration. Temple records document the prevalence of extravagant feasting and disregard for religious obligations. When compared to these modern Babylonian records, the well-known biblical story of Belshazzar's feast assumes a new significance, seeming less like a singular story and more like a reflection of broader worries about decadence and divine wrath. Collective responsibility is emphasized in one priestess account from the last siege. We watched the city burn, the king fled in vain, palaces turned to fire. This story captures the sense of societal failure in real time and is not later commentary. The most eerie inscription forewarns that whoever rebuilds Babylon shall die in fire and blood, implying that the Babylonians themselves saw their fall as a punishment for moral failings, rather than a straightforward military setback. These translations reveal a society that is acutely conscious of its own decline. The tablets record growing inequality, religious hypocrisy, and the preference for wealth over wisdom as warning signs that were acknowledged but ignored. The leaders, according to the scribes, disregarded popular unrest and divine signs in favor of preserving their wealth and authority, even as the foundations grew weaker. Many civilizations exhibit this pattern of internal decay before external conquest, but Babylon's documentation is especially thorough. An almost real-time account of moral and social collapse was created by the society's extensive documentation of its own decline, even as the society around them collapsed. Scribes continued to record the empire's failure using the very bureaucracy that had kept it afloat. Thus, Cyrus' military conquest seems to have been the culmination of collapse rather than its cause. The society the Persian forces faced was already weakened by lack of leadership, internal strife, and a loss of spiritual unity. Due to neglect and a lack of priorities, the Babylonians had already undermined their own defenses, as evidenced by the well-known tale of the Euphrates River being diverted to allow invasion. This case study illustrates how societies can remain highly self-aware while failing to alter their direction. The Babylonian scribes were clear and insightful in their documentation of their society's issues, but the ruling class ignored their cautions. A recurrent theme in civilizational collapse is the disconnect between awareness and action, implying that awareness by itself cannot stop decline in the absence of corresponding adjustments in governance and behavior. The Babylonian example, which shows how material success can conceal underlying spiritual and moral decay, is especially pertinent to contemporary societies. Their thorough chronicling of their own downfall serves as a warning about the perils of putting material wealth and influence ahead of moral principles and social cohesiveness. The tablets serve as reminders of a society that recognized its situation, but was powerless to change its direction. What if the tale of Atlantis is more than just a philosophical parable? For centuries, academics disregarded Plato's story as a work of fiction, a warning against arrogance rather than a chronicle. A shared memory preserved across cultures that evolved in total isolation from one another is suggested by the artificial intelligence analysis of several ancient texts. Significant similarities between Sumerian, Minoan, and Egyptian accounts of a catastrophic oceanic collapse can be found through algorithmic comparison. The fact that this story is consistent across disparate linguistic traditions suggests that it may preserve collective memory of real, historical events rather than being pure mythology. Various civilizations describe what translates to a great ocean power that fell after crossing ethical boundaries with forbidden energy. Certain details that recur with unnerving similarity can be found in the descriptions. Throughout history, the term black fire has been used to describe a power source that destroyed the environment. According to one passage, this energy caused the sea rose and all was swallowed by silence, implying a tsunami-like event followed by an unusual quiet. These physical descriptions stand out from other mythological depictions of divine punishment because of their specificity. The destruction of Atlantis is always framed in these texts as intentional erasure. According to a number of sources, the civilization was destroyed, especially to shield the future from repeating the catastrophe. This language implies that the event was a warning rather than a random calamity, and the destruction was justified as essential prevention rather than punitive measures. The goal is still to shield future generations from similar ethical or technological transgressions. The consistency across cultures suggests a potential shared ancestry in real-world historical experience. Such specific narrative details shouldn't be shared between geographically and chronologically separated civilizations unless they are based on shared memories or events. The depictions of cutting-edge technology, moral failing, and catastrophic collapse seem too similar to be written off as separate works of literature. A pattern of caution about knowledge devoid of wisdom becomes apparent. It appears that ancient civilizations recognized the perils of technological progress without commensurate ethical development, as evidenced by the forbidden energy source described in various traditions. The repercussions of seeking power without comprehending its obligations or constraints continue to be the main focus. This narrative pattern acts as a universal warning against going too far and the peril of developing too rapidly at the expense of ethical and natural systems. In addition to being about a single vanished civilization, The Atlantis narrative also explores the human propensity to overextend one's abilities without corresponding wisdom. This warning, as enduring relevance over millennia, indicates that it speaks to basic human weaknesses rather than particular historical contexts. Different cultures maintained the fundamental caution about the connection between technological power and ethical responsibility, while tailoring specifics to their own contexts. Other traditions also exhibit this pattern of cautionary memory, indicating that ancient societies made a concerted effort to preserve warnings about knowledge that could be harmful. These stories' continuity throughout space and time suggests they fulfilled significant cultural purposes beyond simple narrative. What these preserved warnings tell us about how ancient societies recognized their own vulnerabilities may be the real significance. Through records and stories that would endure beyond their particular circumstances, they institutionalized the warning that technological advancement without an ethical foundation could lead to disaster. As a result, the story of Atlantis changes from a standalone myth to a cross-cultural warning system and a preserved memory about the perils of trying to learn without wisdom and upsetting natural systems. According to this reinterpretation, ancient societies had a sophisticated understanding of the interrelationships between sustainability, ethics, and technology that we are only now starting to recognize thanks to these translations aided by artificial intelligence. Even the most powerful military empires in history were susceptible to internal disintegration. The fall of the Hittite Empire has frequently been attributed to outside forces, enigmatic sea peoples, or massive invasions that broke through fortified walls. Translations of court documents and military communications by artificial intelligence paint a different picture of what is happening within the empire's own government. The tablets outline methodical tactics that turned strength into vulnerability and eventually undermined the civilization from within. Instructions for what amounts to early biological warfare can be found in military correspondence. In one message, troops are instructed to place the infected dead into the enemy's water wells, implying that water sources have been purposefully contaminated. This strategy wasn't unique. It can be found in several campaign documents, indicating that the use of illness as a weapon was institutionalized. Because plagues invariably spread beyond their intended targets, the practice had unintended consequences that affected both military forces and Hittite populations. Court records demonstrate how these strategies evolved inward. A climate of distrust and terror was fostered by the ruling class's use of plague as a mechanism of political control. The purges of officials suspected of disloyalty are described in administrative tablets, with rivals being eliminated under the guise of disease outbreaks. The government structure lost credibility as a result of this paranoid atmosphere, which made it more challenging to coordinate responses to external threats. Records pertaining to royal families show especially unsettling trends. As the plague swept through the populace, power struggles grew more intense, with brothers killing their siblings to gain control, as evidenced by the last king's personal tablets, which describe how the priests declared it divine punishment. The leadership may have interpreted their growing crises through spiritual frameworks, viewing their suffering as justified rather than looking at pragmatic reasons. Particular weight is given to the last inscription from the royal archives. We used death to maintain power, but in the end, death came for us. This acknowledgement of their own part in the collapse comes out as a contemporary observation rather than a reflection of the past. The leadership was aware that their tactics were hurting them, but they persisted in using them, stuck in a pattern of conduct that would ultimately lead to their demise. It becomes evident that external conquest only dealt a final blow to a society that was already severely damaged. The Hittite Empire's military prowess and fortified cities couldn't protect against the erosion of social cohesion and political stability. When used carelessly, the very tactics that had kept them in power centralized control, and brutal tactics became the tools of their downfall. This pattern of internal conflict preceding external collapse appears across numerous empires throughout history. The Hittite case illustrates how a civilization's internal structures deteriorate and how military might alone cannot save it. Royal paranoia, political purges, and biological warfare all produced weaknesses that were eventually taken advantage of by outside forces. These records' translation compels us to re-evaluate the real reasons why empires fall. We must look at how societies threaten their own stability through internal practices, rather than just concentrating on external military threats. When the Hittites' methods turned inward, their advanced knowledge of administration and warfare was unable to protect them from the fallout. According to this evidence, civilizations frequently include the seeds of their own demise in their plans for success. When conditions change, or when used without restriction, the strategies that allow for growth and dominance can turn into liabilities. The history of the Hittite Empire serves as a warning about the perils of using illness and terror as weapons, and how those who do so may suffer the consequences. A pattern of self-inflicted vulnerability emerges, where a society is so preoccupied with preserving control that it overlooks the pillars supporting its own stability. The external threats that ultimately overtook the Hittites only took advantage of vulnerabilities that had been growing for generations as a result of internal strife and ill-considered tactics. Civilizations occasionally experience several overlapping crises rather than a single catastrophic event. The demise of the Indus Valley civilization has frequently been reduced to a story about climate change, with the once fertile area drying up and being abandoned. River systems and water sources are seen to be changing in archaeological evidence, but decipherments of artificial intelligence paint a more nuanced picture of concurrent failures that undermine this highly developed society from several angles. The river has dried, the wells are empty. This simple statement encapsulates the immediate reality of water scarcity impacting agriculture and everyday survival, as documented by Mohenjo-daro's records. However, other tablets show that social repercussions are occurring concurrently with environmental stress. According to one account, bodies lie across the streets. Those once brothers now turn on each other, signifying that civil war was breaking out as resources became scarcer. The wording alludes to kinship networks disintegrating under stress and turning friendly bonds into rivalries. Several translated texts reveal a devastating plague as an additional contributing factor. Administrative records document the abandonment of entire neighborhoods as a result of disease spread, while medical records detail symptoms and attempted treatments. Under the combined strain of illness, conflict, and environmental stress, the social structures that had upheld harmony and order started to disintegrate. This accelerated the disintegration of the civilization by creating a cascade effect in which each issue made the others worse. Correspondence between city centers that has been recovered reveals frantic requests for help that never came. Mohenjo-daro begs for food shipments and medical assistance in letters to Harappa, describing dwindling supplies and growing casualties. The deciphered responses describe their own inadequacies and incapacity to assist, demonstrating how the crises simultaneously impacted several urban centers. Particularly harmful was this collapse in the intercity support system that had kept the civilization going for centuries. It becomes evident that the Indus Valley gradually unraveled due to a series of interconnected failures rather than abruptly disappearing. The social unrest brought about by the environmental changes made it easier for diseases to spread, which made it even harder for society to deal with the initial environmental problems. Because of this, it became impossible to solve any one issue without also addressing the others, creating a feedback loop of degradation. The advanced water management and urban planning techniques that had made the civilization prosperous were ultimately unable to defend against this confluence of dangers. When several systems started to fail at once, their very complexity, which had previously been a strength, may have turned into a liability. The magnitude of the convergent crises seems to have overwhelmed the centralized administration that oversaw these systems. Even highly organized societies are susceptible to systemic risks. As this case study illustrates, The Indus Valley civilization possessed advanced technology, urban planning, and administrative systems, yet these couldn't prevent collapse when environmental, social, and health crises coincided. According to the pattern, civilizations are most at risk from groups of problems that interact and intensify one another, rather than from isolated threats. The translated documents offer a sobering look at perseverance. They depict a society that is conscious of its worsening conditions, but is unable to respond effectively on several fronts at once. The disconnect between identifying issues and taking action is especially noticeable when those issues are interrelated and reinforce one another. This example is especially pertinent to comprehending contemporary systemic risks. The experience of the Indus Valley shows how social unrest, environmental change, and public health emergencies can combine to overwhelm even highly developed societies. Their experience serves as a cautionary tale about the value of preserving redundancy and flexibility across several systems as opposed to focusing solely on efficiency. The brutality of ancient bureaucracies was meticulously documented. Chinese oracle bones, such as turtle shells and ox bones used for royal fortune-telling, have long been studied as basic divination artifacts. According to the traditional view, they were early instances of spiritual practice that documented inquiries concerning military campaigns, weather, and harvests. Instead of studying their more sinister administrative roles, scholars concentrated on their contribution to the understanding of ancient religious beliefs, reinterpreting these artifacts as something more systematic as possible through artificial intelligence. The algorithms identified the markings as coded records of state violence by spotting patterns in what had previously been thought of as random or ornamental markings. Following military triumphs or political upheavals, dozens of people were ritually sacrificed, according to inscriptions from the Shang dynasty. According to this scale, these were formalized procedures for preserving authority rather than sporadic ceremonies. The phrase, "when whispers of rebellion arise, the entire family is executed," appears in several texts. This terminology suggests policy rather than impromptu punishment, with violence used methodically to crush possible opposition. The meticulous documentation of locations, numbers, and techniques suggests that terror was administered with bureaucratic efficiency. This is further developed in texts from the Qin dynasty, which describe extensive information control. The statement, "Books are burned, but the memory of scholars must also be erased," illustrates the realization that merely destroying materials was insufficient. Social memory and intellectual heritage also needed to be eradicated. In order to control history, the state demanded that people who could preserve alternative narratives be removed, in addition to burning scrolls. Han inscriptions demonstrate even more advanced control mechanisms. By removing entire lines of descent from official registries, policies essentially erased families from the annals of history. In addition to punishing opposition, this bureaucratic disappearance prevented further claims to authority or recognition. Future generations' perceptions of reality could be influenced by the state's control over the official narrative. Instead of random violence, evidence of deliberate state policy is revealed. The fact that these practices were consistent across dynasties indicates that they were formalized strategies for retaining power. The record scale suggests that they represented a substantial distribution of administrative focus and state resources. Over time, these behaviors probably exacerbated social instability. An atmosphere of mistrust and terror would have been fostered by the ongoing threat of severe punishment and the erasure of history. As people became aware of the state's propensity for extreme violence and manipulation, their faith in institutions would have diminished. Coordinated responses to internal or external threats became more challenging in this setting. According to the pattern, systematic violence and information control were useful short-term strategies for retaining power, but they eventually damaged institutional trust and social cohesiveness. These practices made dynasties vulnerable to internal or external pressures by fostering cultures where suspicion hindered cooperation and fear outweighed loyalty. We must reevaluate the causes of the Chinese dynastic collapse in light of this evidence. We must take into account how state violence and information control undermined the social foundations required for long-term stability, going beyond external invasion or economic concerns. It's possible that the strategies employed to hold on to power ultimately played a role in its demise. As a result, the oracle bones become intricate historical records rather than merely religious artifacts. The administrative mechanisms of state control and their possible effects on societal resilience are revealed, in addition to ancient spiritual beliefs. Although this pattern of utilizing violence and disinformation to hold on to power is present in many civilizations, China's copious documentation offers especially thorough proof of its institutionalization and scope. The real importance is in comprehending how ancient states struck a balance between stability and control, and how the strategies they used to hold on to power may have ultimately short-circuited their lifespan. Internal betrayal was too strong for even cities carved out of rock. Petra's stunning architecture alluded to a prosperous and stable society that thrived in the desert thanks to advanced trade and engineering. The rose-red cliffs that were carved into temples and tombs gave the impression of permanence and group accomplishment. Civilization that had used cooperation and resourcefulness to master its surroundings. Archaeological interpretation was dominated for centuries by this idea of Petra as a peaceful desert capital. Behind the stunning exteriors, a different reality is revealed by artificial intelligence deciphering Nabatean inscriptions. The revealing statement in council records, "When silver buys loyalty, stone no longer protects," implies that elite corruption was undermining the social contracts that kept the city afloat. This was systematic betrayal rather than sporadic graft, where loyalty was increasingly dictated by wealth rather than customary ties or a common goal. Instead of serving the common good, the water management system that enabled Petra in the desert environment seems to have turned into a weapon of political control. According to texts, during internal conflicts, water sources are purposefully contaminated, transforming the city's lifeline into a weapon against adversaries. Once managed for the collective's survival, water now serves factional interests, which is a fundamental violation of the social covenant. Particular weight is given to the Central Council's last known declaration: "No more oaths, no more faith, only power and shadow." This implies a total collapse of trust between rulers and ruled, where customary agreements and reciprocal duties were replaced by pure power dynamics. The foundation of the civilization changed from a common goal to blatant ambition. A pattern of elite accumulation and treachery emerges, leaving the society open to outside influences. The willingness of the populace to defend the city probably declined as wealth was concentrated among fewer. Families and traditional social contracts disintegrated. When internal cohesion broke down, the advanced water systems and defensive positions that had shielded Petra for generations were rendered useless. This case study illustrates how social decay cannot be prevented by physical fortifications. In order to withstand a military siege, the Nabateans had carved their city into cliffs, but they were unable to design a defense against the deterioration of mutual trust and purpose. In the end, their magnificent architecture was unable to make up for the social covenants that had been broken. The pattern implies that societies need more than just economic success and physical infrastructure to survive. Just as important as technological advancements or military might seem to be the reciprocal responsibilities and trust that allow for collective action, even the most remarkable physical achievements are at risk when these social underpinnings are undermined. Petra's tale serves as a reminder that invisible ties of trust and reciprocal responsibility, rather than just stone and water, are what keep civilizations alive. Their carved architecture's grandeur contrasts sharply with the brittleness of the social structures that made it possible. Across fallen civilizations, this gap between social cohesiveness and physical accomplishment becomes a persistent vulnerability. Understanding how societies strike a balance between the interests of the group and individual ambition may be the real lesson. Petra's initial success probably involved successfully achieving this balance, whereas its decline was a reflection of this equilibrium's breakdown. The transition from collective water management to weaponized control serves as an example of how systems intended for the good of all can be twisted to serve the interests of certain factions. Several civilizations exhibit this pattern of internal treachery followed by external vulnerability. But Petra's case is especially striking because of its physical location. A potent visual metaphor for this recurrent historical dynamic is produced by the contrast between the carved stone's durability and the brittleness of the social structures it contained. Even warrior cultures used writing to record their internal conflicts. Viking runic inscriptions have frequently been romanticized as valiant proclamations etched into wood and stone that commemorate individual bravery, conquest, and expeditions. By portraying these markings as simple narratives of exploration and conflict, the conventional interpretation strengthened the idea that Norse society was preoccupied with outward success and fighting skills. This perspective ignored the intricate social structures that supported their civilization in favor of highlighting their achievements at sea. These runes served more intricate purposes than mere bragging rights. According to artificial intelligence analysis, the algorithms identified phrasing and placement patterns in the inscriptions that indicate they were documents of ritual obligations and social contracts. In one translated curse, the words "who betrays the blood of his clan shall be flayed under the moonlight" foreshadow official penalties for severing familial ties. This was an institutionalized enforcement of social norms, not a threat. Instructions found in ritual texts may be unsettling to readers in the modern era. In several ceremonial contexts, the phrase, "the warrior must cut blood from the one he loves most to prove his courage to Odin," is used. This implies that the strongest emotional ties serve as proving grounds for devotion to the community and gods, and that loyalty is formally tested through personal sacrifice. These instructions' specificity suggests that they were standardized procedures rather than one-off actions. These textual revelations are corroborated by archaeological evidence of execution and dismemberment incorporated into funeral rites can be found at gravesites, where remains are arranged in accordance with predetermined ritual patterns. These results imply that violence served formal purposes beyond simple punishment or warfare, and was institutionalized within Norse religious and social practices. Ritual violence as social maintenance is consistently depicted in the translated texts and the physical evidence. The most fascinating finding relates to spiral rune patterns that were formerly thought to be ornamental. These were recognized by AI pattern recognition as intricate memory systems, with the translated idea that memory itself can be weaponized. This implies that the Vikings viewed historical narrative and information control as instruments of social power. Another means of preserving authority and unity was the capacity to strategically engrave information into collective memory. The result is a society that uses various forms of controlled violence, physical, emotional, and psychological, to maintain stability. The runic inscriptions demonstrate an advanced comprehension of the use of memory, ritual, and social pressure to uphold group cohesiveness and enforce norms. For centuries, Norse society was able to operate efficiently over great geographic distances thanks to this system. It's possible that their eventual decline happened when these practices were rejected by shifting populations or became unsustainable. Ritual violence and memory control systems that had retained their traditional structure probably faced difficulties as Norse societies came into contact with Christianity and other cultural influences. It is possible that the very systems that kept their civilization going have turned into barriers to change and adaptation. This pattern implies that even societies that were praised for their accomplishments on the outside were dependent on weak internal control systems. The Viking case illustrates how warrior cultures used strategies to stay cohesive, which ultimately reduced their adaptability to new situations. Their remarkable outward achievements were based on internal underpinnings that became less flexible over time. Understanding how societies strike a balance between cohesiveness and adaptability is where the real significance lies. It's possible that the Vikings' highly successful systems for upholding social order among scattered communities left them exposed when conditions demanded significant change. Throughout human civilizations, this conflict between stability and adaptability seems to be a persistent issue. Knowledge itself can occasionally turn into the danger it was intended to prevent. For centuries, the devastation of the Library of Alexandria has been explained by well-known stories, such as an unintentional fire during Caesar's campaign or a clash between newly emerging religions. According to these explanations, the loss was a result of circumstance rather than intentional action. Tragic collateral damage and larger historical conflicts, although the extent of the devastation made it one of the greatest intellectual tragedies in history. The general consensus was that it was more of an accident than a planned result. Recovered administrative documents analyzed by artificial intelligence show a more measured reality. According to a decoded letter from a library official, the scrolls did not burn by accident, they were ordered to be destroyed. This is not conjecture. Rather, it is first-hand evidence from the institution itself. The wording suggests that knowledge that is considered dangerous to those in power should be specifically targeted for systematic removal rather than haphazard destruction. Even more revealing statements can be found in internal communications. One document acknowledges that our power depends on the ignorance of the people, implying that deliberate policy is preferable to philosophical abstraction. This wasn't just isolated rhetoric. It was also evident in the way that certain materials were singled out. Particular attention was paid to scrolls that dealt with astronomy, philosophy, and royal history. Their destruction was deliberate rather than haphazard. Instead of religious or military necessity, the targeting points to political motivation. Alternative narratives regarding royal lineages and legitimacy were found in historical records. Astronomical knowledge could predict celestial events that rulers used to maintain authority, and philosophical texts questioned established power structures. The selection pattern suggests that the information that threatened dynastic control was purposefully removed, rather than lost at random. This evidence changes our perception of the well-known fire from one of a tragic accident to one of deliberate political arson. The intended result of the operation was knowledge loss, not accidental harm. The extent of the devastation was not the product of a widespread conflict or accident, but rather served particular political objectives. Although many collapsing civilizations exhibit this pattern of information control, Alexandria's case is especially noteworthy because of its function as a knowledge center. To uphold established power structures, the organization that was created to conserve and broaden understanding was methodically dismantled. This is a basic betrayal of the library's mission in the name of political survival. What comes out is a warning about what happens when knowledge is controlled in order to keep power. Restricting the flow of information ultimately limits a society's capacity for adaptation and problem-solving. Stability is eventually threatened by vulnerabilities created by the inaccessibility of the very knowledge that could be used to solve problems. The short-term benefit of information control results in the long-term decline of problem-solving skills. The tale of Alexandria shows how enlightened institutions can be twisted to gain power. The library's extensive holdings were a symbol of the pinnacle of ancient knowledge, as well as a possible danger to those whose power rested on restricting knowledge. Its demise provides an example of how, when confronted with challenges to its legitimacy, power can occasionally choose ignorance over wisdom. This pattern implies that civilizations frequently weaken their own bases by limiting access to information that could enable them to adjust to shifting conditions. Societies become less prepared to face the issues that ultimately lead to their downfall when the very knowledge required to solve new issues is sacrificed. In the name of political expediency, the loss of particular texts may not be the real tragedy of Alexandria. Rather, It is the illustration of how isolated knowledge-based institutions can be twisted to serve their own agenda. This recurrent historical trend serves as a warning about the perils of prioritizing control over knowledge and how decisions of this nature ultimately undermine the societies in which they are made. Even the alignments of stone circles reveal hidden stories. Stonehenge has been interpreted for generations based on its most obvious features, such as the burial remains that suggest funerary functions and the astronomical orientations that suggest celestial observation. A picture of Neolithic society peacefully gazing up at the sky and honoring their ancestors was painted by the enormous sarsen stones placed in precise patterns. According to this interpretation, the location stands as a tribute to early scientific inquiry and religious reflection. A pattern of elite accumulation and treachery emerges, leaving the society open to outside influences. The willingness of the populace to defend the city probably declined as wealth was concentrated among fewer families and traditional social contracts disintegrated. When internal cohesion broke down, the advanced water systems and defensive positions that had shielded Petra for generations were rendered useless. This case study illustrates how social decay cannot be prevented by physical fortifications. In order to withstand a military siege, the Nabateans had carved their city into cliffs, but they were unable to design a defense against the deterioration of mutual trust and purpose. In the end, their magnificent architecture was unable to make up for the social covenants that had been broken. The pattern implies that societies need more than just economic success and physical infrastructure to survive. Just as important as technological advancements or military might seem to be the reciprocal responsibilities and trust that allow for collective action. Even the most remarkable physical achievements are at risk when these social underpinnings are undermined. Petra's tale serves as a reminder that invisible ties of trust and reciprocal responsibility, rather than just stone and water, are what keep civilizations alive. Their carved architecture's grandeur contrasts sharply with the brittleness of the social structures that made it possible. Across fallen civilizations, this gap between social cohesiveness and physical accomplishment becomes a persistent vulnerability. Understanding how societies strike a balance between the interests of the group and individual ambition may be the real lesson. Petra's initial success probably involved successfully achieving this balance, whereas its decline was a reflection of this equilibrium's breakdown. The transition from collective water management to weaponized control serves as an example of how systems intended for the good of all can be twisted to serve the interests of certain factions. Several civilizations exhibit this pattern of internal treachery, followed by external vulnerability. But Petra's case is especially striking because of its physical location. A potent visual metaphor for this recurrent historical dynamic is produced by the contrast between the carved stone's durability and the brittleness of the social structures it contained. Even warrior cultures used writing to record their internal conflicts. Viking runic inscriptions have frequently been romanticized as valiant proclamations etched into wood and stone that commemorate individual bravery, conquest, and expeditions. By portraying these markings as simple narratives of exploration and conflict, the conventional interpretations strengthened the idea that Norse society was preoccupied with outward success and fighting skills. This perspective ignored the intricate social structures that supported their civilization in favor of highlighting their achievements at sea. These runes served more intricate purposes than mere bragging rights. According to artificial intelligence analysis, the algorithms identified phrasing and placement patterns in the inscriptions that indicate they were documents of ritual obligations and social contracts. In one translated curse, the words "who betrays the blood of his clan shall be flayed under the moonlight" foreshadow official penalties for severing familial ties. This was an institutionalized enforcement of social norms, not a threat. Instructions found in ritual texts may be unsettling to readers in the modern era. In several ceremonial contexts, the phrase, "the warrior must cut blood from the one he loves most to prove his courage to Odin," is used. This implies that the strongest emotional ties serve as proving grounds for devotion to the community and gods, and that loyalty is formally tested through personal sacrifice. These instructions' specificity suggests that they were standardized procedures rather than one-off actions. These textual revelations are corroborated by archaeological evidence of execution and dismemberment incorporated into funeral rites can be found at gravesites, where remains are arranged in accordance with predetermined ritual patterns. These results imply that violence served formal purposes beyond simple punishment or warfare, and was institutionalized within Norse religious and social practices. Ritual violence as social maintenance is consistently depicted in the translated texts and the physical evidence. The most fascinating finding relates to spiral rune patterns that were formerly thought to be ornamental. These were recognized by AI pattern recognition as intricate memory systems, with the translated idea that memory itself can be weaponized. This implies that the Vikings viewed historical narrative and information control as instruments of social power. Another means of preserving authority and unity was the capacity to strategically engrave information into collective memory. The result is a society that uses various forms of controlled violence, physical, emotional, and psychological, to maintain stability. The runic inscriptions demonstrate an advanced comprehension of the use of memory, ritual, and social pressure to uphold group cohesiveness and enforce norms. For centuries, Norse society was able to operate efficiently over great geographic distances thanks to this system. It's possible that their eventual decline happened when these practices were rejected by shifting populations or became unsustainable. Ritual violence and memory control systems that had retained their traditional structure probably faced difficulties as Norse societies came into contact with Christianity and other cultural influences. It is possible that the very systems that kept their civilization going have turned into barriers to change and adaptation. This pattern implies that even societies that were praised for their accomplishments on the outside were dependent on weak internal control systems. The Viking case illustrates how warrior cultures used strategies to stay cohesive, which ultimately reduced their adaptability to new situations. Their remarkable outward achievements were based on internal underpinnings that became less flexible over time. Understanding how societies strike a balance between cohesiveness and adaptability is where the real significance lies. It's possible that the Vikings' highly successful systems for upholding social order among scattered communities left them exposed when conditions demanded significant change. Throughout human civilizations, this conflict between stability and adaptability seems to be a persistent issue. Knowledge itself can occasionally turn into the danger it was intended to prevent. For centuries, the devastation of the Library of Alexandria has been explained by well-known stories, such as an unintentional fire during Caesar's campaign or a clash between newly emerging religions. According to these explanations, the loss was a result of circumstance rather than intentional action. Tragic collateral damage and larger historical conflicts, although the extent of the devastation made it one of the greatest intellectual tragedies in history. The general consensus was that it was more of an accident than a planned result. Recovered administrative documents analyzed by artificial intelligence show a more measured reality. According to a decoded letter from a library official, the scrolls did not burn by accident, they were ordered to be destroyed. This is not conjecture. Rather, it is first-hand evidence from the institution itself. The wording suggests that knowledge that is considered dangerous to those in power should be specifically targeted for systematic removal rather than haphazard destruction. Even more revealing statements can be found in internal communications. One document acknowledges that our power depends on the ignorance of the people, implying that deliberate policy is preferable to philosophical abstraction. This wasn't just isolated rhetoric. It was also evident in the way that certain materials were singled out. Particular attention was paid to scrolls that dealt with astronomy, philosophy, and royal history. Their destruction was deliberate rather than haphazard. Instead of religious or military necessity, the targeting points to political motivation. Alternative narratives regarding royal lineages and legitimacy were found in historical records. Astronomical knowledge could predict celestial events that rulers used to maintain authority, and philosophical texts questioned established power structures. The selection pattern suggests that the information that threatened dynastic control was purposefully removed, rather than lost at random. This evidence changes our perception of the well-known fire from one of a tragic accident to one of deliberate political arson. The intended result of the operation was knowledge loss, not accidental harm. The extent of the devastation was not the product of a widespread conflict or accident, but rather served particular political objectives. Although many collapsing civilizations exhibit this pattern of information control, Alexandria's case is especially noteworthy because of its function as a knowledge center. To uphold established power structures, the organization that was created to conserve and broaden understanding was methodically dismantled. This is a basic betrayal of the library's mission in the name of political survival. What comes out is a warning about what happens when knowledge is controlled in order to keep power. Restricting the flow of information ultimately limits a society's capacity for adaptation and problem-solving. Stability is eventually threatened by vulnerabilities created by the inaccessibility of the very knowledge that could be used to solve problems. The short-term benefit of information control results in the long-term decline of problem-solving skills. The tale of Alexandria shows how enlightened institutions can be twisted to gain power. The library's extensive holdings were a symbol of the pinnacle of ancient knowledge, as well as a possible danger to those whose power rested on restricting knowledge. Its demise provides an example of how, when confronted with challenges to its legitimacy, power can occasionally choose ignorance over wisdom. This pattern implies that civilizations frequently weaken their own bases by limiting access to information that could enable them to adjust to shifting conditions. Societies become less prepared to face the issues that ultimately lead to their downfall when the very knowledge required to solve new issues is sacrificed. In the name of political expediency, the loss of particular texts may not be the real tragedy of Alexandria. Rather, it is the illustration of how isolated knowledge-based institutions can be twisted to serve their own agenda. This recurrent historical trend serves as a warning about the perils of prioritizing control over knowledge and how decisions of this nature ultimately undermine the societies in which they are made. Even the alignments of stone circles reveal hidden stories. Stonehenge has been interpreted for generations based on its most obvious features, such as the burial remains that suggest funerary functions and the astronomical orientations that suggest celestial observation. A picture of Neolithic society peacefully gazing up at the sky and honoring their ancestors was painted by the enormous sarsen stones placed in precise patterns. According to this interpretation, the location stands as a tribute to early scientific inquiry and religious reflection. The stone carvings analysis by artificial intelligence reveals a more intricate process at work. The algorithm recognized markings that were previously disregarded as a complex symbolic system that encoded instructions for rituals. The 13th night of the blood moon, first blood touches the ground, the wind ceases. The stones begin to speak, reads one deciphered passage. Several translated passages give rise to the idea that the stones might wake if the blood flowed in the right patterns. This language suggests that rather than serving as a passive observatory, the monument served as a ceremonial engine for cosmic exchange. The stones were active participants in rituals intended to mediate between the spiritual and human worlds, not just markers for celestial events. Within this ritual framework, their positioning and carvings fulfilled practical functions. The magnitude of the proposed sacrifices suggests organized religious violence as opposed to personal practice. The texts outline figures and protocols that would necessitate community involvement and concerted effort. This was an institutionalized practice that was incorporated into Neolithic society's social and religious framework rather than an occasional ceremony. These practices were essential to their worldview, as evidenced by the resources needed to build and maintain the site. This pattern of ritual violence is found throughout Neolithic Europe, indicating that these were common cultural practices rather than isolated customs. Consistent themes of cosmic mediation and sacrifice can be seen at similar sites, with aligned stones and suggestive carvings. The regional consistency suggests a common understanding of the role ritual violence played in their respective social and spiritual systems. The final abandonment of the site might be a reflection of societal shifts or opposition to these customs. The ritual violence that had supported Neolithic societies' spiritual framework may have become unsustainable or socially unacceptable as they developed. Their abandonment is significant because the meticulous attention to astronomical alignment indicates that these practices were deeply ingrained in their conception of cosmic order. Our idealized perception of the builders of ancient monuments is called into question by this reimagining of Neolithic spirituality. The evidence points to societies that practiced systematic ritual violence as part of their cosmological understanding, rather than being peaceful skywatchers. The magnificent stone circles serve as proof of intricate belief systems involving cosmic mediation and sacrifice, in addition to being architectural marvels. This pattern demonstrates how ancient societies developed sophisticated spiritual technologies for interacting with forces they believed governed their world. The visible parts of these systems were symbolized by the physical monuments, but the practices they made possible included aspects that are unsettling to contemporary sensibilities. Another illustration of how civilizations contain contradictions within their cultural frameworks is the gap between architectural achievement and ritual practice. Understanding how societies strike a balance between social sustainability and spiritual practices may hold the real significance. Even deeply rooted ritual systems may eventually become unsustainable, as evidenced by the site's eventual abandonment. Throughout human history, there has been a pattern of adopting and rejecting practices, which reflects the constant balancing act between social realities and spiritual beliefs. Thus, Stonehenge becomes a documented example of Neolithic ritual practice rather than a mysterious artifact. The stones serve as reminders of an intricate spiritual system that was ultimately superseded by evolving societal perceptions and values. Their tenacity over millennia is a reminder that human societies constantly reevaluate the customs that support them, occasionally eschewing even the most striking examples of those customs in architecture. Certain knowledge could be harmful if misused, according to some traditions. Jewish mystical rituals have frequently been portrayed as solely spiritual pursuits aimed at enlightenment and a closer relationship with God, while ignoring their warnings against unchecked information dissemination. This interpretation highlighted their philosophical aspects. Instead of limiting access to knowledge, the conventional perspective positioned these traditions as aiming for greater understanding. Analysis using artificial intelligence shows that these esoteric writings had intentional limitations, patterns of redaction and omission that suggested the systematic suppression of particular information were found by the algorithm. It was said that the Sefer Anista, or Scroll of Forgetting, was purposefully purified to drive the unprepared mad, suggesting intentional editing as opposed to unintentional loss. This language implies an understanding that certain information may be harmful to one's mental or spiritual well-being if it is encountered without adequate preparation. In restored passages, rituals are described in which bloodlines, curses, and the true names of souls carry power. This language demonstrates an awareness that some information may be misused or weaponized outside of appropriate contexts. The specificity implies that these were real-world observations about the potentially harmful use of knowledge rather than theoretical issues. Inscriptions from Imsada allude to a secret alliance among priests across cultures. To stifle knowledge, This implies that people from different cultures understood that some information needed to be managed collectively, rather than shared freely. The cross-cultural collaboration suggests a common awareness of possible risks rather than discrete worries. In the Megalithashicha, the phrase deliberate refusal to pass on memory, a choice to erase rather than preserve, refers to the deliberate choice of what information should be preserved and what should be left to deteriorate. The wording implies moral judgments between the risks of transmission and the obligations of preservation. The result is an advanced knowledge management concept that goes beyond basic information control. These traditions acknowledge that certain understanding necessitated corresponding spiritual and ethical preparation. These cautions' enduring relevance across generations demonstrates a profound concern for the interplay between responsibility and knowledge. This pattern implies that ancient wisdom traditions recognized the potential harm that could result from spiritual or technological advancements that are not accompanied by ethical development. The emphasis is still on preserving equilibrium between knowledge and insight, between competence and accountability. This strategy reflects an alternative paradigm for advancement that prioritizes the sustainable growth of knowledge over unrestricted expansion. The way these traditions viewed the connection between authority and accountability may hold the real significance. They understood that some knowledge was inherently dangerous and needed to be controlled by community supervision and ethical frameworks. This is in contrast to contemporary beliefs that all information ought to be freely accessible, regardless of the repercussions. These old cautions provide insight into current discussions regarding the spread of information and the advancement of technology. They contend that unrestricted access to potent knowledge without commensurate ethical growth could lead to weaknesses rather than advantages. A persistent problem in human civilization seems to be striking a balance between responsibility and openness. Instead of outright forbidden, a pattern of deliberate restraint emerges, while acknowledging that certain conditions and preparations were necessary for the safe handling of knowledge. These traditions did not reject it. This method demonstrates a deep comprehension of how societies handle potentially hazardous innovations. This viewpoint calls into question straightforward narratives about inhibition and progress. These traditions imply that limitations may be essential elements of sustainable progress, rather than being seen as barriers to progress. Understanding how civilizations deal with the difficulties of expansion and change depends heavily on the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. These old cautions' continued applicability implies that they use potent knowledge to address basic facets of human interaction. Their enduring popularity over millennia suggests that they highlight ageless conflicts between competence and accountability, as well as between ethical application and discovery. Consistent patterns start to show up in this statistical analysis. When we look at these civilizations as components of a broader human experience, rather than as separate narratives. Although each society's historical circumstances and cultural accomplishments were distinct, their collapse stories show common vulnerabilities that cut across space and time. Instead of being the result of random historical accidents, civilizational failure follows predictable pathways, as demonstrated by the artificial intelligence synthesis of multiple translated records. Throughout these varied societies, internal decay always comes before external conquest. Years before the arrival of the invaders, the Sumerian tablets recorded social disintegration and ritual violence. While their armies still seemed to be powerful, Babylonian records detailed elite corruption and moral decay. Social tensions beneath the surface of military expansion were exposed by Viking runes. This pattern implies that civilizations that have already been undermined from within usually suffer the final blow at the hands of outside forces. In many instances, extreme social control techniques and ritual violence show up as early warning indicators. Periods of notable decline were preceded by the state-sanctioned executions in ancient China, the institutionalized violence at Gobekli Tepe, and the systematic human sacrifice in Sumerian temples. These behaviors frequently reflected attempts to keep control by taking ever more drastic measures, which undermined legitimacy and revealed underlying social stress. Social breakdown is consistently correlated with environmental overreach. The Maya drought responses, the deforestation on Easter Island, and the ineffective water management in the Indus Valley all demonstrate how societies have outgrown their ecological carrying capacity. Resource scarcity exacerbated social conflict in feedback loops, where people were aware of these environmental limits but unable to alter their course. According to the translated records, information control and knowledge suppression seem to accelerate collapse rather than stop it. Jewish customs of restricted knowledge, Chinese oracle bone records of historical erasure, and the purposeful destruction of the Alexandrian library all show how restricting the flow of information can impair one's ability to solve problems. Societies that manipulated information to stay in power frequently found themselves less prepared to deal with new problems. These autonomous civilizations all share similar thematic patterns: neglect of environmental boundaries, pride in technological accomplishments without commensurate ethical growth, and an imbalance between the application of wisdom and the acquisition of knowledge seem to be recurring themes. Longer surviving civilizations generally exhibited stronger institutional reform capabilities, flexibility in social structures, and the ability to modify long-standing customs to fit novel situations. A framework for comprehending civilizational vulnerability is the result of this cross-cultural analysis. The patterns indicate that multiple internal stress points, interacting and intensifying one another, are more likely to cause collapse than single causes. Knowledge management problems, social disintegration, environmental stress, and poor leadership all have a tendency to group together and support one another, instead of maximizing one system at the expense of another. The most resilient societies seem to have preserved equilibrium across several systems. They struck a balance between social control and individual liberty, economic growth and environmental sustainability, and technological advancement and ethical consideration. Adaptation to new challenges was made possible by this systemic equilibrium. These patterns provide us with identifiable warning indicators that we can see in historical contexts, not predictions. Understanding the kinds of imbalances and stresses that have historically preceded decline is more valuable than predicting particular results. This information offers insight into how societies preserve stability and how they might prevent recurring collapse patterns. The warnings that have been translated over millennia indicate that issues of scale, complexity, and sustainability are persistent in human civilizations. The longevity of societies seems to depend on how they handle these difficulties, whether through denial, reform, or adaptation. The collective knowledge of these vanished societies provides understanding of the persistent conflicts between development and stability, tradition and innovation, and authority and accountability. It is easy to think of ancient civilizations as archaic societies whose problems are irrelevant to our highly developed technological world. We may believe that we are immune to the weaknesses that doomed these ancient cultures because of our institutional frameworks, scientific knowledge, and global connectivity. However, the themes that emerge from these deciphered texts feel incredibly current and speak directly to issues that we are currently facing. Think about the similarities between our current situation and environmental overreach, though on a different scale. Easter Island's meticulous records of resource depletion and deforestation reflect the current global climate crisis. Their statement that the island has no more trees resonates with our melting glaciers and vanishing species. Our continued reliance on fossil fuels, despite being aware of the consequences, reflects the same cognitive dissonance they documented when they recognized environmental limits while continuing unsustainable practices. Information control keeps evolving. Modern systems use algorithmic filtering, disinformation campaigns, and data manipulation, whereas ancient regimes destroyed scrolls and removed ancestries from official records. Today's information ecosystems, where it is becoming more and more difficult to discern fact from fiction, are analogous to the Alexandrian library's willful destruction of knowledge. Although it is applied through different technologies, the old notion that controlling information equates to controlling power is still valid today. Along well-known lines, social cohesiveness breaks down. Current economic disparities could easily be described by the Babylonian tablets that discuss elite corruption and wealth inequality. Today's waning faith in governments, the media, and established authorities is a reflection of the breakdown of trust between institutions and populations that undermined ancient civilizations. Historical blueprints of internal decay are reflected in the current patterns of political polarization and social fragmentation. Though it changes, ritualized violence endures. In contrast to ancient societies that engaged in formal human sacrifice, contemporary conflicts use economic sanctions and drone strikes to accomplish comparable goals in different ways. Automated warfare and mass incarceration systems perpetuate the institutionalized violence that upheld power structures in Chinese courts and Sumerian temples. Despite changes in technology, the fundamental dynamics are still the same. Scale and speed are the main areas of difference. Because our civilization functions on a global scale rather than a regional one, its possible collapse would be even more devastating. Because of the vulnerabilities created by our interconnected systems, failure in one area can quickly spread to others. These risks are accelerated by the rate of change, which means we have less time to identify and neutralize new threats before they become serious. These age-old cautions provide identifiable patterns rather than precise forecasts. They offer a framework for comprehending how societies deteriorate internally before disintegrating externally. The importance is in identifying these trends in our own society before they become entrenched. We can spot possible intervention points and early warning indicators thanks to this historical perspective. It becomes evident that basic human vulnerabilities are not eliminated by technological advancement. The fundamental dynamics of power, greed, fear, and short-sightedness that weakened earlier civilizations have not been altered by our advanced technologies. If anything, our technological prowess has increased our capacity for both success and devastation, because they reflect accumulated knowledge about societal vulnerabilities that cut across time and technology. These decoded messages are significant. They serve as a reminder that societies need equilibrium in a variety of systems, including the political, social, ethical, and environmental ones. No amount of advanced technology can make up for ignoring these essential needs for societies to be sustainable. Perhaps the real lesson is that the same fundamental truths about sustainability and accountability are continually being rediscoverable by human civilization. Instead of repeating their mistakes, these ancient voices from millennia ago encourage us to learn from their experiences. Even though our technological contexts are very different, we can see how closely their documented struggles resemble our own, making their warnings even more valuable. These deciphered warnings reveal a pattern that is common to all civilizations. Without wisdom, power crumbles. Without humility, knowledge consumes. Ignoring the past ensures that it will come back. These age-old voices exhort us to consider our own societal decisions with humility and foresight. Their teachings over the ages provide accumulated knowledge about human vulnerability and resiliency rather than dire prophecies. We still have the option to repeat their patterns or listen to them and draw lessons from their experiences. The tablets and stones have spoken. We now have to determine the implications of their warnings for our future.